I grew up in Paris, Missouri. It's just a really small town, lots of farms. Everybody kind of knows everybody. It's just a very small, rural community.
In the summer of 1994, 22-year-old Melanie Shepard is leading a hectic life, leaving her little time for romance.
I was going to school at College of the Ozarks. I was studying education. I wanted to be an English teacher. I was just really busy going to school and working. I was a cashier at a convenience store. I really didn't date that much.
Everything changes when a 28-year-old mechanic walks into the store one night. His name is James Addy.
There was a long line of people, and he was trying to check out, and he kind of yelled up to the front of the line, "Will you hurry up?" And I just kind of gave it right back to him. I said, "I'm doing the best I can." And he said, "Well, I'm cooking barbecue at my house." And I said, "I don't get any, I don't care." So later that night, he brought me some barbecue. And that's kind of how we met. I thought it was very sweet that he would go out of his way to do that for me. It was very nice. On a busy night, it was a nice surprise.
James returns to the store a week later, and this time, he's not buying groceries.
He asked me to come over, and that was our first date. He cooked supper for me. The food was good, and he's feeding me a lot. So that was kind of fun. We got to know each other pretty well, pretty fast. We both really liked each other. He just seemed like the kind of person that could take care of me and take care of himself and take care of a family. He seemed like husband material. Just a total package, you know?
Not long after they start dating, James drops a bombshell.
He shares with her that he's been married 3 times. So that's kind of shocking for Melanie. 3 times by 28, that's a lot.
He said they were cheaters. They were unfaithful and not good people. They were just gold diggers and trying to take advantage of him and of his good nature and his goodwill.
Despite this awkward beginning, 6 months into the relationship, things are getting serious, and James pops the question.
They were sitting on the couch talking, and he just sort of blurted out, "Will you marry me?"
I said, yes, of course. At that age, you want fairy tales and romance and happy endings. It was fun going to pick out a ring and being engaged. Felt like a grown-up. I felt very confident that I was with a good person. I was with the right person, and he wanted the same things that I did.
In the spring of 1995, James and Melanie get married. The newlyweds seem destined for a happy family life and soon welcome 2 kids.
Just had our perfect little family, 1 boy and 1 girl. I am a nurturing person, and I want to take care of my kids, and I want to take care of my husband, and I want to take care of my house. I think he saw that, yeah, that would work. That would work for him. That would work as a wife and good partner in life. I think that's what he wanted. He was a strong person. He was the protector and very capable of handling life. He was definitely the leader of the family. He took care of business.
In 2004, James takes on a higher-paying job as a prison guard, 30 miles away at the Moberly Correctional Center.
He really liked his job. He really did well in his job. He had no problem telling people what to do or being that aggressive person if he had to be. He could keep people in line. I think it was a real ego boost for him to have people listen to him and jump when he said jump. And then he expected it to happen at home, too. He wanted to have someone just follow along with whatever he said. It was tough because I'm not a prisoner. He didn't like that I had my own opinions, and he would get upset.
After 8 years of marriage and with her children now in school, Melanie looks to pursue her teaching career. But James puts his foot down.
He didn't want me to work. He didn't want me to go back to school. He kept saying, oh no, you need to stay at home. You need to stay at home. He just didn't want me out in the world and, come home and talk about my coworkers and talk about my job. He didn't want that. He wanted me to be focused solely on him. And he got very upset with me. He said I don't support him, and it was a big problem. It was a huge fight. That was very unexpected. I thought we were a team. I thought, we were building this life together, and I was supposed to just leave everything behind and just be his wife now. I didn't like that.
The arguments only get worse. For someone who craves control, James starts losing it.
He could get so mad that he would be threatening and intimidating and throw things. I can remember going through a lot of salt and pepper shakers. I just would always just stand there because I don't want to be intimidated. I don't like that feeling. I don't like backing down from that.
11 years into the marriage and desperate for a sense of independence, Melanie finally defies James.
I started working. I was a substitute teacher, which was perfect while the kids were in school. It felt like this is where I should be. This is what I wanted to do. And it was nice to get out. I always said I liked being a stay-at-home mom, but I liked when it ended too. I liked a new thing to do.
For James, I think it was probably very scary. She has priorities and parts of her life that don't center around him anymore. I think at this point in time, James realizes that maybe Melanie is not going to be the submissive wife that he wants.
6 years into his job at the prison, James's work has strangely become all-consuming, and he disappears for longer lengths of time.
He would leave about 5:30 in the morning. It only takes 45 minutes to get there. So he left pretty early. And then he wouldn't get home till about 5 at night. That's 2 hours after his shift ended. I would just question him, why are you always so late? And he was angry with me. He's like, why can't you leave me alone? He would just say, well, I stopped and talked to people, or I went to get gas. Sometimes he'd have to wait on a train to go by. He had all these little excuses. So it was just odd.
There's a reason James is spending longer hours away from home, and it has nothing to do with work. He's spending more and more time with one of the other guards. Her name is Molly Watson.
Molly wanted to get a job that could make pretty good money that she could save back for her and her son, so she could go back to school. And so she started out at the Moberly prison. Her ultimate goal was to be a psychologist.
Molly needs the money, as she's a single mom, raising her son on her own.
Molly was a really good mom. She gave him all the love in the world.
I am very much a huge geek. I hate being called a nerd.
I wanted Molly to find somebody that respected her for her, that treated her like she deserved to be treated,
In 2011, just a year into her new job, Molly has started dating someone new, and she's excited to introduce him to her brother.
When I first met him, I just kind of looked at him and I was like, hi, I'm Tim. And he's just like, yeah, I'm James. And he put his head down. Just something about him, I didn't like him from the get-go. He was very standoffish. He would never look you in the eye to talk to you. He didn't really seem to care.
James's off-putting demeanor likely raised questions as to who he was, what were his intentions, and really, what was he hiding?
Just something was off about him. I knew there's something not right about this guy.
In 2011, Melanie and James Addy have been married for 16 years. Across town, Molly Watson has fallen hard for the same James Addy.
She adored him. She doted on him. She loved him unconditionally. She made James her #1 priority, and that's what James was looking for. He wanted somebody who put him first, always.
Molly's family is less than impressed with this new man in her life, who's 16 years her senior.
Molly told me he was in the process of getting a divorce, for 6 years, that he had like 2 kids.
He says that he's trying to be there for his kids and do what's best for them, so he's still living with his estranged wife.
I thought that was weird, I've been divorced and I wouldn't live with my ex-wife.
James visits Molly almost every day after work at her parents' house. They spend all their time together in her bedroom.
Molly is living at home with her parents. She's very close with her family. He's not making any attempts to really build a relationship with them. And so it just seems like there's secrets and there's something that's just not right.
He would try to keep her away from everybody. James would try to separate Molly from her son. You could always tell that he did not want Molly's son in their life at all. My dad didn't like him. My mom flat out told me, I don't like the guy. And it killed me to watch my sister keep dating him because, I knew she could do better.
Molly is so enamored with James, she brushes her family's concerns aside.
She was in love. Love is blind, and in her case, that's the truth. You could point out things to her that were obvious and she would deny it.
In 2016, 5 years into their relationship, Molly and James take their first trip together.
He received a phone call from one of his friends. He got off the phone and I said, "What was that about?" And he said, "Oh, he wants me to go to Mexico with him."
Melanie encourages him to go with his coworkers and have a good time. In reality, James wasn't going with coworkers. He was going to Mexico with Molly, his secret girlfriend. For Molly, this was amazing. She wanted to go on a vacation with James so badly. She was madly in love with him, and this was just an opportunity for them to grow their relationship and spend more time together.
It looked like when they started to go on vacation that they were more committed to each other. Like he was maybe getting serious about it. We've had the doubts about him, but okay. Maybe this is good.
When James returns home a week later, Melanie notices something odd about his photos.
I said, "Well, where are the other people that you went with?" And he said, "Oh, I don't want pictures of them." So there was only pictures of him and the resort and the beach. And that's all I saw.
A year later, unbeknownst to Melanie, James takes her to the same vacation spot where he took Molly.
It was so nice. We just had each other and we spent all our time together, and it was a great trip. We had so much fun.
At this point, James has been carrying on this double life for so long that he's gotten so used to it and comfortable, to the point where he's arrogant enough to take his wife on the same vacation he took his mistress.
In October 2017, when James lies and tells Molly his divorce is finalized, she's ready to take the next step.
The only thing she told me about the proposal was that she had asked James to marry her, and he said yes. Molly looked really happy, and could tell that she was ready to get married.
Now he's got to figure out what he's going to do because he still has a wife.
Molly quickly busies herself prepping for her dream wedding. She picks April 29th, 2018 as the date, and she's planning to hold it at the Stony Creek Hotel, where Samantha Cohen is their wedding planner.
She had a smile on her face the entire time we would meet. She just had, this look in her eye of like, this is my day, I'm so excited, let's make this happen. She wanted to be the princess for the day. Every girl imagines their wedding day and wanting to be the bride or the princess walking down the aisle.
That's what she wanted, find Prince Charming, settle down happily ever after. But I thought, what's she thinking, she don't want to marry this guy. Nothing good can come of it.
During the Christmas holidays, just a few months before the wedding is to take place, James shares some devastating news with Molly.
He tells Molly that his ex-wife Melanie has been in a terrible car accident. She's actually on life support. And he needs to be there for his children and to help them with the care of their mother.
Molly felt bad for James, told him, if he needed her to back off any, and give him some space, she would, and that she was there for him, whatever he needed, that she understood he was doing it for his kids. I think it made Molly feel guilty about the wedding coming up.
Is Melanie's supposed accident a strategy for James to get out of the wedding? Melanie, in fact, is alive and well, for now. But soon, she will come perilously close to death.
There's this really strong gas smell in our bedroom.
I believe that Melanie was at a very high risk of being killed.
To think that you're so close to losing your life, it's terrifying. It was late at night, midnight, 1 o'clock. I woke up and I smelled gas. It was very, very strong in the bedroom. I thought, well, this is not dissipating, this is not normal. And Jim wasn't there. He wasn't in our bed, he wasn't in the bathroom. So I got up and I went to find Jim to tell him that there's this really strong gas smell.
She goes downstairs and she finds that all the windows and doors are closed.
Jim wasn't anywhere in the house. And I thought, this could be serious. This particular night, he was outside on the deck, smoking a cigarette. It was unusual for him to be outside smoking. He would usually just smoke in the dining room at the window. So I told him, I said, really strong gas smell, I don't know what it is. He said, okay, well, you stay out here. And he went back in the bedroom and opened the windows and just said, I don't know, it's probably some farm equipment outside.
But it's a little suspicious because the windows are closed, and when she goes outside, she doesn't have this overpowering odor anymore.
Eventually, the smell did go away, and I was able to go back to bed, so I don't have an explanation for that. It was so strange.
While Melanie worries about James and his odd behavior, Molly Watson is blissfully anticipating her fairy tale wedding. After 7 years of dating James, her dream is finally coming true.
Her excitement was so palpable. I mean, you watch her videos and she just radiates excitement and love.
Hi everyone, it's Molly, and
Here is the dress on me, and I have to say I was actually really impressed.
You can tell just by talking to her, she has always dreamt of her wedding. I mean, she had 3 wedding dresses. Like, this was not just any normal day in her life. She's been dreaming of how this wedding was gonna look for years. I think she finally found, you know, her Prince Charming, and this was the next chapter of her life.
Molly seems unaware that James lacks the same enthusiasm, but his detached demeanor is obvious to others.
When I was meeting with James and Molly, it was all Molly giving the input. He really just sat there kind of staring off into space. He was a very quiet man, didn't smile often, and just kind of was there. He didn't really give much input into the conversations, and he just didn't seem like he really wanted to be there. He didn't seem to care.
He said, you know, oh, well, we're getting married, you know, as long as it shuts her up, you know, whatever. That's kind of his attitude towards it.
On April 22nd, just a week before the wedding, James drops another bombshell about his supposed ex-wife.
We were told she was in this coma, and they determined that she would never recover from her injuries. From what Molly told me directly, Melanie's life support, they were going to go ahead and pull the plug because they decided that she was too brain damaged and that they were going to have to just let her go.
I, reached out to Molly to get a final in-person meeting scheduled with her and James, and she had emailed me back saying, I don't know if James will be able to make the meeting as his ex-wife had just passed away that weekend before.
James is lying, and Melanie is still very much alive, unbeknownst to Molly and everyone else around her.
I think James wanted so badly to get out of this predicament he had created that he was hoping by creating this tragic situation and backstory that maybe Molly would come to the conclusion to cancel the wedding, and that would sort of be his get out of jail free card. But that's not what happened. He needed to keep up the charade as the loving fiance, and so he doesn't cancel the wedding because he knows that's going to devastate her.
2 days before the wedding, James still hasn't told Molly the truth.
That Friday when he came in by himself after dropped everything off and paid, I asked him, how are you feeling? And the only words that he said was that she was driving him crazy.
It's probably pretty common for grooms to be a little annoyed with brides as it gets close to the wedding. But for James, I think Molly was driving him crazy because he knew the walls were closing in. He was still married to Melanie, and he had to figure something out quickly.
The night of April 27th, Molly abruptly leaves her parents' home without much of an explanation.
She was actually making something to eat when suddenly she got a phone call. And after that phone call, Molly leaves really quickly. And she just sort of rushed out of the house. Given that she was cooking, her parents felt like she would be back really quickly.
At his home, James tells his wife Melanie he's stepping out.
He was out in the garage, and then he came in and said he was going to go to a friend's house. This was about 7 o'clock, and then I went to bed about 7:30. I usually go to bed pretty early.
Later that night, a driver on a deserted road notices something unusual.
He sees these 2 vehicles parked on the side of the road. He figures one of them is having engine trouble, so he stops to see if he can help. An older man tells him that everything's fine, he can go. And so he proceeds on his way. On his way back, he passes the same spot, only this time there's only one vehicle.
The Monroe County Sheriff's Office got a call around 10:30 at night that a passerby named Glenn McSparron had found a woman in a very remote area of Monroe County on a low water crossing. He told police that there was a woman who was laying in front of a car on this dusty, dirty country road. Her eyes were open. She did not appear alive to him.
Investigators rush to the scene.
Police quickly identify the cause of death as a gunshot wound to the head. This woman is out in the middle of nowhere, and she's been shot execution style. It leads them to believe this was a planned murder, and someone lured her out there. And they identify her by finding a marriage license on her passenger seat that identifies her as Molly Watson, who's engaged to be married to James Addy.
In the early hours of April 28th, just one day before Tim Watson's sister is to be married, he gets a call from his dad.
As soon as I saw what time it was, I knew it was something serious. He said, "Timmy, the highway patrol just left our house. They found Molly dead on this dirt road." And immediately I was in shock.
About 2:30 in the morning, I got up and I looked out the window and there were 4 vehicles with flashing lights. I went to the door and Jim was there first. He opened the door for these 4 cops. So I asked them, "What's going on? Why are you here?" And nobody would answer me. Finally, somebody asked me, he said, "Who are you?" And I pointed to Jim and said, "Well, I'm his wife." And Jim said, "Yes, that's my wife." And then the mood kind of changed a little bit.
Investigators had no idea what they were walking into. They thought they were making a death notification to a fiance, and they find out he's already married for 23 years. They discovered Melanie Addy, and everything changed. Suddenly, James Addy, who they expected to be the bereaved fiance who would surely receive the worst news of his entire life, was now a suspect.
Detectives escort James into the dining room for an interview, while another investigator asks Melanie curious questions.
Where were you tonight? What did you do tonight? Do you know Molly Watson? She's been found dead. I didn't know who that was. I didn't know who Molly was. I didn't know how she was at all related to my family. They told me who Molly was and that they were gonna get married. I asked him, do you have the right person? Are you sure you have the right person? Because that's my husband. I was numb, I was in shock. It was hard to get this through my head because this was my husband and this was our life and this other person had no place in it and the story did not make sense.
Out of Melanie's earshot, James comes clean to the officers about his relationship with Molly.
He admitted the affair and said that it had been going on for 7 years.
He tells them, though, that he had absolutely nothing to do with Molly's death.
They asked him where he was that evening. James Addy responded that he left the home around 7 o'clock to go visit a friend. He said the friend was not home, so he turned around and came back home and arrived around 8:30 that evening, and that he went to bed shortly thereafter.
Did James go to bed as he claims to police, or did he secretly meet Molly? When forensics examined the bride-to-be's computer, they find evidence to suggest she had been obsessed by one thing in the 24 hours leading up to her death. And it wasn't her wedding.
Molly Watson had been searching for evidence of Melanie Addy's death. She was searching to see if there was an obituary or any evidence of this horrible accident that had eventually led to Melanie's death. Of course, Melanie Addy was very much alive, and she was unable to find any evidence that she had passed away.
Did Molly come to the crushing realization that Melanie was alive and there would be no wedding?
I think she questioned James on it, and at that point, he knew the jig was up and he had to do something.
Back at the murder scene, investigators scour the area and find Molly's cell phone and a discarded t-shirt. Police also go through Molly's phone records and are able to piece together her last known movements.
The last phone call she ever made was 22 minutes long. 22 minutes, which is the exact amount of time it took Molly Watson to drive from her home to her death. The entire time she was on the phone with James Addy.
I think somehow he convinced her to meet up with him so they could talk about it, and he got her out in the middle of nowhere and took her life.
Police looked at the victimology of Molly Watson. Who did she know? Who in her life might want her dead? And they determined that only one person, James Addy, had the motive, means, and opportunity to take Molly's life.
James Addy is arrested and taken into custody. The next day, Melanie starts looking for evidence of James's double life.
I went out to the garage, which was kind of his domain. It was a lot of storage things that we kept up there, a lot of boxes. And I started looking a little closer at the boxes, and these were not my things. These were Molly's things. They had her name on the boxes. And that's when I found the photo album of them on vacation. And a lot of kitchen stuff, just household things that were at my house. She was planning on moving in, I guess. It was very overwhelming. I didn't know how to process this. He was home every night. I don't know when he saw her or how they formed a relationship over 7 years and why he would go forward with marrying her or planning this wedding when he was still married to me. How is this supposed to work? I don't know what he was thinking. I was just angry, just angry.
Melanie thinks back to the night of the gas leak and is left to wonder about James's possible intentions. The thought is chilling.
I started to put all of that together about the gas in the bedroom. I think the idea was for me not to wake up. I think I was supposed to die. I think he was trying to get rid of one of us.
Had James tried to kill Melanie but failed, so he chose Molly instead? James Addy has been arrested and charged with first-degree murder in the death of Molly Watson. A heartbroken Melanie confronts her husband.
I went to the jail a few days after he was arrested and asked him, what the hell? What are you doing? This is our life. And he didn't have any answers. He apologized for the affair. He never admitted that he killed her. He said that he was sorry and he didn't know we had such a perfect life. Too late now. He lost everything and he knew it. He knew everything was gone. He knew I wasn't going to stick around. I was not going to be his support system anymore. This was it. We were done. James's case goes before the court in the spring of 2021.
prosecutors paint a picture for the jury of what they believe happened that fateful night.
The night of April 27th, I believe that he called Molly Watson and told her to get in her car and start driving to this remote area. She arrived at the low water crossing, opened the door, and he shot her once, and he panicked. He left Molly's body there for anyone to find. Going into the trial, we felt that the evidence against James Addy was overwhelming.
The T-shirt found by police is a key piece of evidence.
In addition to the T-shirt having gunshot residue on it and the victim's blood on it, there was something else important about the T-shirts. That T-shirt had been made by James Addy's daughter, Emma Addy.
And this was specific to Emma. She had made this shirt and kind of messed up the design a little bit.
She was able to identify that T-shirt as one that she had made and given to her father. So the T-shirt was extremely important because we know it came from the crime scene because it had Molly's blood on it. And we know that it came from the defendant's home.
James had told police that on the night of the murder, he'd gone out but was home by 8:30 p.m. His daughter, though, contradicts that story when faced with the daunting task of testifying against her own father.
Emma Addy was interviewed about her father's whereabouts, and she gave a very different story.
I was still up doing homework at around 10 p.m., and that's around the time that Dad came home.
He returns home and sees his daughter Emma still up. He's a little surprised, and Emma described him as being nervous. James gets in the shower right away. And Emma also notices that her dad does laundry, something that would normally be her mom's job.
And did you smell anything? Yes, I smelled bleach.
Emma Addy's testimony was key to dispute the alibi that James Addy had provided to the police. And to be able to come into court and to tell the world that your father lied to the police, it was incredible.
She had a tough job and she handled it. She did really, really well. She's an inspiration to me. She is. She's amazing.
I just plead with the jury to give this monster the max sentence possible.
On April 28th, 2021, what would have been Molly and James' third anniversary had they been married, James Addy is found guilty of Molly's murder.
I hereby sentence you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole.
I just wanted justice for Molly. That's all I cared about. You know, as long as I heard those words guilty come out of the judge's mouth, and thank God they did.
He had the means, he had the motive. He didn't have a good alibi. He wasn't home that night. So it all kind of added up. He's absolutely responsible for this.
James Addy is convicted, but it's still hard to comprehend his sickening actions.
It's unfathomable that James thought the solution to the problem was to kill someone instead of just breaking up with them. In his mind, that was the right thing to do, and that's what's scary. It's terrifying that that is his way out.
Had he have walked away, just never talked to her again, we'd be fine with that. You know, she'd be upset. She'd still be here. He chose to take her life. He's an evil person.
It's tragic to think that somebody who was so excited to be a bride and to have a happily ever after instead had this tragic ending.
The family, they're the ones that suffer in this. They are the true victims. They've lost Molly, and they will lose her, you know, at family get-togethers and holidays and vacations, and she's just not there for them.
She definitely knows how much I love her. I would like Molly to be remembered as the sweet, loving, giving person she was. She'd do anything for anybody.
I'd hug her and just say how sorry I am that this happened to her. And I hope she feels that justice has been served. And I hope she's okay.
I still go out to her gravesite and I have conversations with her, and she said everything's fine, everything's okay.
As for Melanie, she has found a semblance of peace in her life.
It's good that it's finally over. I'm divorced and on my own, but I'm much happier on my own than I was married. I'm good all by myself, I really am. I'm just really lucky that I have a good job, a fun job, great coworkers. I have a good life. I'm happy.
The night Florida forgot how to sleep began with a sound that should never echo through a quiet neighborhood, a sound so small it barely registered at first, a door closing too softly, a car engine turning once and dying, then starting again, the headlights cutting across a row of palm trees like a blade, and somewhere inside one of those houses, a clock blinking 12:47 a.m., the last recorded proof that time was still moving forward. Because from that moment on, for one family, for one street, for an entire town, time would freeze around a single question that would not loosen its grip for decades. How does someone disappear from their own life without leaving a trace behind? It was late summer, the kind of Florida heat that lingers even after midnight, thick and wet, pressing against skin, trapping sounds, trapping secrets, and the house sat there like it had every other night. Lights off, lawn trimmed, windows dark, nothing to suggest that within hours it would become a crime scene, a media spectacle, a cold case that would outlive marriages, careers, even memories. The victim, a name spoken so often later it would lose its edges, had ended the day doing ordinary things, errands, phone calls, a promise to be home early, the sort of routine that feels unimportant until it vanishes. There was no sign of a struggle, no shattered glass, no overturned furniture, just absence, sudden and absolute, the kind that makes investigators pause at the threshold and feel it in their gut before they can explain it on paper. By sunrise, neighbors were standing in driveways, arms crossed, eyes narrowed, watching police cars idle at the curb, the red and blue lights washing over white fences and parked sedans, the unspoken realization settling in that something terrible had arrived without announcing itself. Officers moved carefully, methodically, cameras flashing, not because they knew what they were looking for, but because they feared what they might miss. Inside the house, everything was too normal. Shoes by the door, a coffee mug in the sink, a calendar on the fridge marked with future plans that now had no owner. The air held no scream, no blood, no obvious violence, only the heavier weight of a person who should have been there and wasn't. The first hours were filled with hope, the dangerous kind, the kind that tells you this is probably nothing, maybe a misunderstanding, maybe a voluntary disappearance, maybe a delayed return. Detectives asked the questions they always ask. When did you last see them? What were they wearing? Did they seem upset? Did they mention leaving? Did they have enemies, debts, secrets? And every answer came back clean, too clean, as if someone had wiped the story down before handing it over. Friends insisted there were no warning signs. Co-workers described routine. Family members spoke through tears and clenched jaws, promising cooperation, begging for answers, their grief raw and convincing, their words filling the silence where a person used to be. But as the day stretched on and turned heavy, the case began to harden into something else, something colder, something with sharper edges. Phone records showed nothing unusual. Bank accounts remained untouched. No luggage was missing. No goodbye notes waited to be discovered. If this had been a choice, it was a perfect one, too perfect, as if designed by someone who understood exactly how disappearances were investigated and exactly how to frustrate them. Search teams combed nearby woods, drainage canals, vacant lots, the Florida landscape swallowing voices and footsteps, offering nothing back. Helicopters traced slow circles overhead. Dogs lost the scent. Flyers went up. Tips came in, wild and contradictory. Sightings that led nowhere. Rumors that collapsed under scrutiny. Each one adding another layer of noise over the growing silence. The media arrived quickly, cameras hungry, microphones angled toward grieving faces, headlines screaming the same phrases over and over: mysterious disappearance, missing adult, shock to the community, cold case in the making. Words that felt premature at first, almost cruel, but would soon prove prophetic. The town watched itself reflected back through television screens, through newsprint, through speculation, and began to fracture under the pressure. Everyone became a potential witness. Everyone became a suspect in their own imagination. Neighbors replayed sounds they thought they heard. Strangers noticed unfamiliar cars. Every detail, no matter how small, was dragged into the light, examined, discarded, then picked up again when hope demanded it. Detectives returned to the house again and again, convinced that the truth had to be hiding in plain sight, in some overlooked corner, some missed inconsistency. They photographed, measured, cataloged, looking for what didn't belong. They focused on relationships, on family dynamics, on the people closest, because statistically, because experience, because cases like this rarely begin with a stranger. Interviews grew longer, more pointed. Timelines were rebuilt and rebuilt again. Words were compared to previous statements. Emotions were studied not just for sincerity, but for cracks. Grief can look like guilt. Guilt can hide behind grief. The line between them is thin and dangerous. One detail refused to settle, a small thing that nagged at the edges of every report, a late-night movement. A car seen leaving the street around the time of the disappearance, described differently by different witnesses: a dark sedan, a light SUV, headlights on, headlights off. Memory bending under stress, but the time window remained stubbornly fixed, that narrow slice of night when something irreversible had occurred. Investigators chased it, pulling traffic records, questioning residents, scanning surveillance footage from nearby businesses. But in 2001, cameras were sparse, grainy, unreliable, and the trail dissolved into static and shadows. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. The victim's face stared out from posters and screens, a frozen smile, a reminder that the world had moved on without permission. The family remained in the spotlight, their home transformed into a gathering point for vigils and prayers, candles flickering, flowers wilting in the heat, promises spoken into microphones. We will never stop looking. We believe they are alive. Please come home. And yet, behind closed doors, the strain showed. Grief sharpened into anger. Cooperation cooled into defensiveness. Small contradictions surfaced, brushed aside at first, then noted, then quietly flagged. A statement that didn't align with another. A reaction that lingered half a second too long. Nothing solid enough to accuse, nothing clean enough to ignore. Investigators felt the pressure building, from above, from the public, from themselves. A missing person case that refuses to resolve becomes a weight, a question mark hanging over careers. Leads were exhausted. Searches scaled back. Resources reallocated. The language shifted, subtly, painfully, from rescue to recovery, from if to when, from hope to probability. And still, no body, no weapon, no confession, no moment that allowed the case to collapse into a single, terrible explanation. It hovered instead, unresolved, a ghost haunting files and desks, a story that refused to end. By the time the case was officially labeled a cold case, the town had already learned to live with the absence, to fold it into its identity. New families moved in, unaware of the history embedded in the street. Children grew up hearing whispers about the house, about the person who vanished, about how it could happen anywhere, to anyone. Detectives were reassigned, retired, replaced. Evidence was boxed, shelved, cataloged, waiting for a future that might never come. And yet, every so often, a new tip would arrive, a call in the middle of the night, a letter, an anonymous message, pulling the file back into the light, forcing fresh eyes to trace old paths, hoping that time had loosened something it had once locked tight. What no one could see then, not neighbors, not reporters, not even the investigators who had lived inside the case for years, was that the truth had never left the inner circle, that the silence protecting it was not accidental, but constructed, layered, maintained by loyalty, fear, and something darker still. The disappearance was not a clean break from the past, but a wound carefully hidden beneath normalcy, beneath family gatherings, beneath shared holidays and forced smiles, a secret aging alongside everyone else, waiting for the moment when the balance would finally tip. Because in Florida, in 2001, under a sky heavy with heat and secrets, a cold case was born not from chaos, but from control, not from panic, but from planning. And as the years piled up and the story settled into legend, one truth remained buried, stubborn, patient, knowing that eventually, no matter how long it took, night has a way of circling back, and when it does, it brings with it the kind of arrest that doesn't just answer questions, but destroys families, shatters histories, and proves that the most dangerous betrayals are the ones that begin at home. The case did not go cold all at once. It cooled gradually, like metal left outside overnight, warm to the touch at first, then impossible to hold. And the detectives who stayed on it longest could feel that change happening day by day. The way calls slowed, the way supervisors stopped asking for updates, the way urgency quietly drained out of every conversation, replaced by the dull acceptance that whatever had happened in that house in Florida in 2001 had been designed to outlast attention. Files grew thicker even as answers grew thinner, binders stuffed with interviews that contradicted each other just enough to be useless, tips that sounded promising until they weren't, theories that collapsed under the weight of missing proof. Inside the department, the case became shorthand for frustration. New detectives were warned about it, not because it was dangerous, but because it was consuming, the kind of investigation that pulled people in and gave nothing back. Every so often, someone would take a fresh look, convinced that the mistake had been obvious all along, that the answer was hiding between two overlooked lines of a report, but the same walls rose every time. No forensic breakthrough, no credible witness willing to go on record, no physical evidence tying anyone to a crime that officially could not even be named without a body. The law demands certainty, and this case offered only shadows. The family, meanwhile, learned how to perform grief in public. They stood together when cameras appeared, their voices practiced, their statements careful, repeating the same phrases until they lost meaning, asking for privacy while pleading for help, insisting on hope while quietly preparing for the worst. Detectives noticed the change in tone as months turned into years, the way questions were answered more defensively, the way cooperation became conditional, filtered through attorneys and carefully worded emails. It was not enough to accuse, but it was enough to unsettle. Grief does strange things to people, but so does fear, and separating the two is one of the most dangerous tasks in criminal investigation. There were moments when the case flared back to life. A hunter reported bones in a wooded area miles away, prompting a frantic excavation that ended in disappointment. A woman called in claiming she'd seen the missing person in another state, living under a different name, a story that unraveled under scrutiny but still burned weeks of manpower. Each false lead reignited pain for those left behind, reopening wounds that never truly closed, and each dead end reinforced the same terrible pattern. Someone knew what had happened, and they were not talking. Behind the scenes, detectives built profiles they could not officially act on. They mapped relationships, traced arguments, flagged moments of tension that had seemed insignificant at the time. Financial records were re-examined. Phone calls replayed. Family dynamics were dissected in private conversations that never made it into formal reports. Nothing illegal surfaced, but nothing felt right either. Too many coincidences. Too many convenient gaps. Too many memories that shifted just slightly when retold. The kind of inconsistencies that do not scream guilt, but whisper it, over and over, until the whisper becomes impossible to ignore. Years passed. Children who had once held candles at vigils grew up. The house changed hands. The street lost its reputation, then regained it in whispers. The case file gathered dust, then was digitized, then quietly archived again. Detectives retired carrying its weight with them, certain that the truth would surface someday, even if they were no longer there to see it. Cold cases have a strange gravity, pulling back those who once worked them, haunting them with unfinished questions, unresolved nights. What finally shifted was not a confession or a discovery in the ground, but time itself. Time loosened tongues. Time strained relationships that had once held firm. Time introduced new pressures, new conflicts, new resentments. Someone who had been silent for years began to feel that silence as a burden rather than a shield. Someone who had once benefited from keeping the past buried started to realize that the past does not stay buried forever. It waits. The first sign was subtle, easy to dismiss. A call to a tip line, anonymous, cautious, offering nothing concrete, just enough to suggest that the original narrative might be incomplete. Detectives logged it, filed it away, expecting it to fade like so many before it. Then another arrived. Different voice. Similar implication. A pattern began to form, faint but undeniable, pointing not outward to strangers or distant locations, but inward, toward the same small circle that had always surrounded the disappearance. Cold case units thrive on patience. They reopened the file quietly, without press releases or announcements, pulling evidence back into the light piece by piece. Old interviews were played again, this time with fresh ears, pauses and hesitations suddenly louder than the words themselves. Statements that had once seemed consistent now appeared rehearsed. Timelines that had fit neatly together began to show stress fractures. Investigators did not confront anyone yet. They watched. They waited. They compared. Technology, too, had moved on. Records once inaccessible were now searchable in seconds. Communications once thought private could now be traced, patterns identified, connections visualized. The case did not break open, but it began to breathe again, like embers stirred after years of neglect. Detectives followed the smallest threads, knowing that cold cases rarely unravel all at once. They tightened first. Family members noticed the change before anyone told them. Unmarked cars parked a little longer on the street. Old questions resurfaced in casual conversations. Requests for clarification framed as routine. The balance that had held for so long began to wobble. Trust eroded. Old alliances weakened. The past, long managed and compartmentalized, refused to stay quiet. Tension crept into interactions, into phone calls, into late-night arguments that carried echoes of a night no one wanted to revisit. And then, without warning, the rhythm changed completely. A detective made a call that had been rehearsed 100 times but never placed. A supervisor authorized a move that had been debated for years. Paperwork shifted from review to action. Surveillance became constant. Every step was deliberate, careful, aware that one mistake could collapse everything. This was not a race. It was a trap, slowly closing. The person at the center of it all did not panic at first. They had lived with this for years. They had answered questions before. They had survived scrutiny. They believed, perhaps honestly, that they always would. But pressure has a way of finding cracks even in the strongest defenses. Small slips appeared. A detail misstated. A timeline adjusted without explanation. A reaction that no longer matched the question. Nothing dramatic. Nothing cinematic. Just enough. Late one night, long after most of the town had gone to sleep, a decision was made. The kind that cannot be undone. The kind that turns suspicion into action. The kind that transforms a story people whisper about into a headline that explodes across screens before dawn. Officers moved quietly, deliberately, knocking on a door that had stood untouched by law enforcement for years, the sound echoing down a hallway heavy with history. Inside, a family secret that had survived time, scrutiny, and silence finally ran out of places to hide. And as the cuffs clicked into place under harsh light, the cold case that Florida had learned to live with began its most shocking transformation yet, revealing that the disappearance from 2001 had never been an unsolved mystery to everyone. Only to those who believed family was the last place betrayal could take root. The arrest did not come with flashing lights or shouting neighbors. It came wrapped in procedural calm, in clipped commands spoken low, in the soft metallic sound of handcuffs closing where trust once lived. And by the time the sun rose over Florida that morning, the story had already escaped the house and turned into something uncontainable. News alerts buzzed phones before coffee was poured, before doors were unlocked, before anyone had time to process what it meant that a case buried for years had suddenly clawed its way back into the present with a single, devastating claim. The truth had been inside the family all along. Reporters rushed to fill the vacuum with words, with speculation, with old photographs dragged out of archives and repurposed as breaking news. Cold case solved. Family betrayal. Late-night arrest. Each headline struck like a blunt instrument, not just against the person in custody, but against everyone who had stood beside them at vigils, who had defended them in conversations, who had dismissed doubts as cruelty. The town reeled, not because someone had been arrested, but because of who it was, because the face now circulating on screens was not that of a shadowy outsider, but someone woven tightly into the victim's life, someone whose presence at memorials had once been considered proof of innocence. Inside the department, there was no celebration, only tension sharpened by the knowledge that an arrest without a body is not a victory, it is a gamble. Detectives moved carefully, aware that the next hours would determine whether years of quiet work would hold or collapse. Interrogation rooms were prepared. Evidence lists were reviewed again and again. Prosecutors demanded clarity, demanded narrative, demanded certainty. You cannot charge someone on suspicion alone, not after all this time, not when memories have faded and stories have calcified. Every move now had to be precise. The suspect sat alone under fluorescent lights, older than the last time their face had appeared in public coverage, the years etched into posture and expression. This was not the panicked figure people expect to see after an arrest, not someone unraveling under pressure. This was someone who had rehearsed this moment without knowing it, someone who had lived alongside the possibility of this room for so long that it no longer felt unreal. When questioning began, the answers came smoothly, confidently, almost eagerly, as if relief and dread had finally collided. They denied everything, of course. Denial is the first language of survival. They spoke of love, of loss, of the pain of unanswered questions, positioning themselves not as a suspect, but as a fellow victim of the disappearance. They pointed to the years spent under suspicion, the whispers, the looks, the burden of grief carried quietly. Detectives listened, not because they believed every word, but because they knew lies reveal themselves over time, not in volume, but in repetition. The same phrases returned. The same emotional beats hit on cue. It sounded practiced because it was. Outside the room, investigators tracked reactions rippling outward. Other family members scrambled for attorneys. Phones rang unanswered. Statements once freely given were suddenly filtered, delayed, revised. The family unit, once presented as unified, fractured visibly under pressure. Old resentments surfaced. Blame shifted. Silence hardened. These reactions were not evidence, but they were context, and context in a cold case can be just as telling as fingerprints. The absence of a body haunted every conversation. Without it, defense attorneys would argue that no crime had occurred, that disappearance is not proof of murder, that speculation fueled by time and tragedy had finally tipped into accusation. Prosecutors knew this. Detectives knew this. And somewhere in the background of every decision was the same unspoken fear. What if they were too late? What if time had not only hidden the truth, but destroyed the means to prove it? Then came the cracks. Small at first, barely noticeable. A detail mentioned casually that did not match earlier accounts. A correction offered too quickly. A timeline adjusted by minutes, then hours. The suspect's confidence wavered, not dramatically, but enough. Investigators pressed gently, circling back, asking the same questions in slightly different ways, letting silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. Silence is dangerous. Silence invites memory. Silence invites mistakes. Meanwhile, the community processed the shock in real time. Talk radio buzzed with arguments. Social media split into camps, those convinced of guilt, those warning against rushing to judgment. People replayed old footage, analyzing body language with the benefit of hindsight, convinced they could now see what had been invisible before. Friends of the family questioned their own memories. Did they miss something? Did they ignore signs because it was easier to believe in innocence than to confront the alternative? The betrayal was not just legal. It was emotional, collective. Detectives returned to the past with renewed focus, guided by the arrest but not blinded by it. They re-examined the night of the disappearance hour by hour, minute by minute, this time assuming the impossible, that the person everyone trusted had something to hide. That assumption changed everything. Movements once dismissed as routine became suspicious. Delays once explained away took on weight. The late-night car sighting resurfaced, now sharper, now anchored to a specific vehicle, a specific opportunity. Old witness statements, reread under this new lens, suddenly aligned in ways they never had before. Pressure mounted behind closed doors. Prosecutors demanded corroboration. Detectives pushed harder. The suspect's story grew more complex as it tried to account for inconsistencies, complexity breeding vulnerability. Every added explanation was another thread investigators could pull. Still, no confession. Still, no body. The case balanced on a knife's edge, one strong gust away from collapsing under reasonable doubt. And yet, something had changed irreversibly. The silence that had protected the truth for years was no longer intact. The arrest had done more than put one person in custody. It had destabilized a carefully maintained version of reality. People who had once felt safe staying quiet now wondered if silence was still an option. Old loyalties felt heavier. Old secrets less manageable. Time, once an ally, had turned hostile. As night fell again over Florida, the same heat settling over the same streets, investigators understood that the most dangerous phase of the case had begun. Not the search, not the waiting, but the unraveling, the slow, painful process of forcing the past into the open, knowing that when it finally emerges, it rarely looks like justice imagined, only like truth stripped bare, leaving behind consequences no one can outrun. By the fourth day after the arrest, the case had become less about what happened in 2001 and more about what had been hidden since, because every hour that passed without a confession or a discovery deepened the same uneasy question. How much of this story had been carefully constructed to survive scrutiny, and how much of it had simply benefited from time and trust? Investigators felt the weight of that question in every decision, in every document they reopened, in every quiet conversation held away from microphones and cameras, because they were no longer chasing a disappearance. They were dismantling a narrative that had been protected for years by familiarity and blood. The suspect remained in custody, outwardly composed, speaking through counsel, projecting the calm of someone who believed the system would protect them as it always had. Detectives knew that demeanor could be a mask or a genuine belief, but either way, it changed nothing about the work ahead. Without a body, without a crime scene marked by blood or violence, the case would live or die on contradictions, on patterns, on moments where the truth slipped just enough to be seen. They returned again to the night of the disappearance, not looking for new facts, but for old ones that now carried different meaning. The house was revisited in memory and in diagrams. Every room reconstructed from photographs, every object reconsidered. What had once looked like normal domestic order now felt deliberate, curated, almost staged. Detectives asked themselves why nothing was disturbed, why absence had been the only signal. They spoke to experts who understood how crimes are concealed within familiar spaces, how violence can be controlled, minimized, erased by someone who knows the environment intimately. The idea that the house itself had been weaponized, not through chaos, but through restraint, began to take shape. At the same time, investigators expanded outward, tracing movements in the hours before and after the disappearance with renewed urgency. Phone records were mapped alongside cell tower data that had not existed in usable form 2 decades earlier. Patterns emerged, subtle but persistent, revealing moments where the suspect's account bent away from the data. Short gaps appeared, windows of time unaccounted for, too small to prove guilt on their own, but too precise to ignore. These were the spaces where something could have happened, where control could have been exerted, where a life could have been redirected toward silence. Family members were interviewed again, this time separately, this time with the arrest hanging in the air like an accusation that did not need to be spoken aloud. The tone shifted immediately. Answers became shorter. Eye contact broke more easily. Old grievances, once buried under collective grief, surfaced unexpectedly. Investigators listened carefully, not just to what was said, but to what was avoided. In cold cases, avoidance is often louder than denial. Each family member carried their own version of the past, and now those versions no longer aligned. One interview, in particular, refused to settle. A relative described a late-night interaction from years ago, something they had dismissed at the time as insignificant, a strange tension, a look exchanged, a silence that lingered too long. It had seemed meaningless then, but now, under the weight of the arrest, it returned with unsettling clarity. Memory is not static. It reshapes itself around new information, and detectives know this, know its dangers, know its power. They documented everything, careful to separate perception from fact, but aware that this was how buried truths often resurfaced, not as revelations, but as discomfort. The pressure extended beyond the investigation itself. Prosecutors pushed for a clear path forward, for a theory that could be presented to a jury without relying on speculation. They needed motive. They needed opportunity. They needed to explain not just how someone disappeared, but why a family member would choose betrayal over honesty, silence over accountability. Detectives debated this late into the night, drawing on years of experience, on patterns seen in other cases, on the psychology of domestic crimes that begin quietly and end in devastation. Control, fear of exposure, a moment that spiraled. These explanations fit, but fitting is not proof. Meanwhile, the public narrative grew louder and more distorted. Commentators argued over guilt and innocence with absolute certainty, as if decades of complexity could be reduced to a single headline. Friends of the family defended the suspect fiercely, citing years of apparent devotion, the absence of prior violence, the cruelty of accusations built on circumstantial evidence. Others saw the arrest as overdue, as validation of doubts they had never felt comfortable voicing. The town divided not along simple lines, but along emotional fault lines, each person confronting their own assumptions about trust and betrayal. Behind closed doors, investigators followed a quieter trail, one that had nothing to do with public opinion. They examined financial stressors from years past, arguments that had been minimized, moments when control had slipped and resentment had surfaced. They spoke to people who had drifted away from the family over time, individuals whose distance now looked less like coincidence and more like survival. These witnesses did not offer smoking guns, but they painted a picture of tension masked by normalcy, of power dynamics that rarely leave visible bruises. As the days turned into weeks, the case entered its most fragile phase. Every new development risked tipping it into collapse or revelation. Detectives knew that the truth, if it came, would likely arrive indirectly, through someone else, through a fracture in loyalty rather than a confession. They waited for that fracture, applied pressure where they could, trusted that time, which had once protected the secret, would now betray it. Late one evening, a message arrived that shifted the balance again. It was not dramatic. It was not definitive. It was a request for a conversation, informal, off the record, from someone connected to the family who had never spoken before. Someone who had carried something quietly for years and could no longer reconcile it with the reality unfolding around them. Investigators understood immediately what this meant. The story was not finished. It was finally beginning to turn on itself. The meeting was arranged without fanfare, no press, no official summons, just a time and a place chosen for privacy, because everyone involved understood that what was about to be shared did not belong under fluorescent lights or within earshot of recorders. The person who came forward arrived alone, shoulders tense, eyes scanning the room as if expecting someone to be there who wasn't, the weight of years visible in the way they sat, in the way their hands never fully rested. This was not a witness seeking attention. This was someone who had spent a long time convincing themselves that silence was safer than truth. They spoke slowly at first, circling the edges, offering fragments rather than a story, moments that had never quite fit but had been ignored because acknowledging them would have meant confronting something unthinkable. A raised voice behind a closed door, a night that ended abruptly, an explanation that felt rehearsed even then. At the time, it had been easier to accept what was offered than to ask what it cost. Families do this. They protect their own, not always out of love, but out of fear of what exposure would destroy. As the conversation deepened, those fragments began to align. The witness described a shift in behavior after the disappearance, subtle but persistent, an insistence on control, an unspoken rule about what could be discussed and what could not. There were moments when questions were met not with grief, but with irritation, moments when curiosity felt dangerous. The message was never explicit, never stated aloud, but it was understood. Some truths were not welcome. Detectives listened without interruption, letting the story unfold at its own pace. Careful not to lead, careful not to contaminate memory with suggestion. They asked for clarification only when necessary, grounding each detail in time, in context, in relationships. The witness admitted they had considered speaking up before, years earlier, but had stopped themselves every time. There were children involved. There were reputations at stake. There was the fear of being wrong, of destroying a family over a suspicion that might never be proven. Silence had felt like the lesser evil. What emerged was not a confession, but something more useful in its own way: corroboration. Details that matched pieces investigators already held but could not connect. The late-night tension, the unexplained movements, the emotional volatility that followed. It was the first time someone from inside the family circle had acknowledged that the official story had never sat right, that beneath the public grief there had always been something brittle, something forced. The witness spoke of a specific night, not the night of the disappearance itself, but one shortly after, when an argument escalated unexpectedly, when anger flared in a way that felt disproportionate, as if fueled by something larger than the moment. Words were said that could not be taken back. A reference slipped out, quickly retracted, but impossible to forget. It had haunted the witness ever since, resurfacing whenever the case appeared in the news, whenever hope was publicly declared. They had learned to live with that haunting, until now. Investigators understood the significance immediately. This was motive taking shape, not as a dramatic revelation, but as pressure building over time. Control challenged. Secrets threatened. The kind of environment where a single moment could tip into violence, then into panic, then into a lifetime of concealment. They asked the witness why they had come forward now. The answer was simple and devastating. The arrest had changed the balance. Silence no longer felt like protection. It felt like complicity. After the meeting, detectives returned to their offices with renewed focus. They cross-referenced the new information with existing files, highlighting overlaps, mapping connections that had once seemed coincidental. The witness's account filled gaps without inventing new ones, strengthening a theory that had hovered just out of reach. It was still circumstantial. It still lacked physical proof, but it now had coherence. It told a story that made sense of the silence, of the control, of the careful maintenance of normalcy over years. The legal reality remained unforgiving. Prosecutors needed more. They needed something that could survive cross-examination, something tangible, something that could anchor the narrative in fact rather than inference. Detectives discussed options late into the night, weighing risks, considering moves that might force the truth into the open or drive it deeper underground. In cold cases, timing is everything. Apply pressure too early, and witnesses retreat. Wait too long, and opportunities disappear. Attention turned, inevitably, back to the suspect. The new information did not contradict their statements outright, but it undermined them subtly, exposing cracks in the version of events they had maintained for years. Detectives prepared to confront those cracks, not with accusations, but with questions designed to test consistency under strain. They knew the suspect had lived with this story for a long time. Changing it now would be difficult. Holding it together would be even harder. As the town watched from a distance, arguing over headlines and court dates, the real work continued quietly, away from public view. The cold case was no longer just a question of what had happened, but of who was willing to live with the consequences of finally telling the truth. The witness who had come forward had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Others, detectives suspected, were standing on that same line, watching, waiting to see what would happen next. And somewhere, buried beneath years of careful control, the truth felt the pressure closing in, forced toward the surface not by force, but by the slow erosion of fear, the realization that secrets do not disappear when buried, they ferment, and when they finally break free, they do so with the power to destroy everything built on top of them. By the time investigators brought the suspect back in for another round of questioning, the tone had shifted in ways that were difficult to measure but impossible to ignore. This was no longer an exercise in information gathering. It was pressure applied with intent, a careful tightening designed to test how long a story could survive when every weakness was gently, relentlessly exposed. The room was the same, the lights unchanged, the chair in the same position, but the balance of power had moved, and both sides felt it immediately. The suspect listened as detectives laid out pieces of the past, not as accusations, but as questions framed with unsettling precision. Dates were mentioned that had once felt distant, now dragged into the present. Conversations were referenced that the suspect had assumed were forgotten or misunderstood. There was no mention of the new witness, no dramatic reveal, only subtle adjustments that signaled something fundamental had changed. The suspect responded smoothly at first, repeating familiar lines, leaning on explanations that had held firm for years. But repetition, under pressure, can become a liability. As the interview continued, pauses stretched longer. Answers arrived slower. The confidence that had once anchored every denial began to erode, replaced by irritation, then defensiveness. Detectives circled back to the same moments again and again, not to trap, but to exhaust. Inconsistencies emerged not as outright contradictions, but as tonal shifts, as changes in emphasis, as details suddenly described with more certainty than before. Memory sharpened when convenient, blurred when dangerous. Outside the room, prosecutors watched closely, aware that this was a delicate phase. Push too hard, and the suspect would shut down entirely. Push too softly, and the moment would pass. They weighed the new witness statement against the existing evidence, calculating whether the narrative could now support charges, whether a jury could be asked to believe in a crime defined by absence. The law is cautious by design. It does not move on intuition, no matter how strong. At the same time, investigators expanded their search beyond the human elements of the case. They revisited locations once dismissed as irrelevant, places mentioned in passing years earlier, areas tied loosely to the suspect's movements on the night of the disappearance. Advances in forensic science had transformed what was possible. Soil analysis, trace evidence, environmental changes over time, all offered new ways to interrogate the past. Teams moved quietly, deliberately, aware that every search risked exposure, every rumor risked interference. The suspect sensed this shift before anyone said a word. Anxiety crept into interactions with attorneys. Requests for information increased. Small, seemingly innocuous questions were asked with growing urgency. The calm facade began to crack under the weight of uncertainty. Control, once absolute, now felt threatened, and for someone who had relied on control to survive the years, that threat was intolerable. Family dynamics deteriorated rapidly. Those who had once stood united began to distance themselves, conversations ending abruptly, trust dissolving under the strain of suspicion. Some avoided contact altogether. Others reached out cautiously, probing for reassurance that never came. The arrest had already done its damage, but the investigation's quiet persistence was doing more. It was forcing everyone connected to the case to choose between loyalty and self-preservation. One evening, detectives received another call. This one was shorter, more direct. A person who had previously declined to speak now wanted to clarify something they had said years ago that no longer felt accurate. They did not frame it as a confession or a revelation, just a correction, a need to set the record straight. Detectives recognized the significance immediately. Corrections are rarely small. They are often the first step toward something much larger. This second conversation reinforced what the first had suggested. Details shifted just enough to expose the fragility of the long-held story. An alibi that had once seemed airtight now appeared conditional. A movement described as routine now carried hesitation. The witness was careful, guarded, but the fear was evident. Fear of being implicated. Fear of having waited too long. Fear of what might happen if the truth came out now, after so many years of silence. The suspect was brought in again, this time confronted with contradictions that could no longer be dismissed as misunderstandings. Detectives did not raise their voices. They did not accuse. They presented facts, timelines, discrepancies, and then waited. Silence filled the room, heavy and suffocating. For the first time, the suspect did not respond immediately. The pause stretched, revealing more than any denial could have. When they finally spoke, the tone had changed. It was not a confession, but it was no longer a performance. The certainty was gone, replaced by something closer to resignation. They spoke of pressure, of misunderstandings, of moments taken out of context. They insisted they had never intended harm, a phrase that landed heavily in the room, because intent had never been the question. Action had. Investigators left the room knowing they were closer than they had ever been, but also aware of how precarious the moment was. Cold cases do not end cleanly. They fracture. They resist closure. The truth, When it comes, often arrives incomplete, compromised by time and fear. But the wall of silence that had protected this secret for so long was no longer intact. It was cracking under its own weight. As night fell again over Florida, the same oppressive heat pressing down, the case hovered on the edge of revelation. Somewhere, buried beneath layers of denial and control, the truth was struggling to surface, and everyone involved could feel it. The question was no longer whether the past would come back. It was who would be left standing when it did. The breakthrough didn't arrive like people imagine, not as a dramatic confession under a spotlight, not as a sudden discovery dug from the ground while cameras roll, but as a quiet shift in human behavior, the kind detectives recognize instantly, because it has nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with fear changing shape. For years, fear had been protective, a wall that kept mouths shut and memories blurred. Now fear was corrosive. It was eating through loyalty from the inside. And when loyalty starts to rot, it doesn't fall apart politely. It collapses in sharp, unexpected pieces. It began with a subpoena that didn't look like a weapon until it landed in the right hands. A routine legal demand, delivered with the same indifferent professionalism as a utility bill, yet it carried a message that felt personal. We're not asking anymore. We're taking. Detectives didn't broadcast it. They didn't need to. Word traveled anyway, through family calls that ended too quickly, through tense conversations in parking lots, through the sudden realization that the old strategy, deny, minimize, stall, was no longer working. Time, which had been the family's greatest ally, had become law enforcement's most patient tool. In the days that followed, investigators watched the suspect's world tighten. Friends who used to answer calls began letting them ring out. Relatives who had once offered public support started insisting on distance for now. Attorneys became the only consistent voices, and even they sounded different, less confident, more urgent, asking questions that were not comforting, questions that hinted at private panic. Where were you that night, exactly? Who can verify it now? What did you say back then, and why does it not match what we have today? The suspect responded with anger, then with exhaustion, then with a fragile kind of calm that felt less like peace and more like surrender to inevitability. Detectives returned to the witness who had come forward, not to squeeze more from them, but to stabilize what had already been given. They knew the defense would attack credibility, memory, motive. They prepared for it the way you prepare for a storm, reinforcing every weak point, documenting every detail, corroborating what could be corroborated. They asked the witness to walk through the past again, slowly, anchoring moments to events that could be verified: a holiday, a job change, a hospital visit, a specific date in a calendar. The witness grew visibly shaken when the detectives pressed on the night shortly after the disappearance. The argument, the slip of words, the sudden retraction. They did not want to repeat it, because repeating it made it real. When they did repeat it, the room went still. It wasn't a confession of murder. It wasn't a direct admission. It was a sentence spoken in anger years ago, a sentence that could be dismissed by anyone determined to dismiss it, and yet it rang with the kind of specificity that doesn't appear out of nowhere. A reference to something that should have been impossible to know unless you knew more than you claimed. A hint of location, a hint of outcome, a hint of ownership over the truth. Detectives wrote it down carefully, word for word, aware that the smallest shift could matter later. And then they did what cold case investigators do best. They treated the hint as a compass, not a conclusion. They mapped it. They went back to the geography of 2001 Florida, the roads as they existed then, not now, the empty lots that have since become subdivisions, the patches of scrub and swamp that were once easy to access in the dark. They pulled old aerial photos, land records, construction timelines. They looked for places that had changed, because change can hide history. A drainage canal widened in 2009. A retention pond dug in 2005. A wooded area cleared in 2003. Each alteration was a potential erasure. Each erasure was a possible answer. The team moved quietly, because public attention is noise, and noise gets people talking in ways that spoil cases. They used unmarked vehicles. They avoided uniforms when they could. They walked ground that looked ordinary to everyone else. Grass and sand and water and mosquitoes, the Florida landscape indifferent to human tragedy. They were searching for the one thing that can turn a theory into a case that holds. something that refuses to be argued away. Meanwhile, the pressure inside the family escalated. Detectives didn't need wiretaps or dramatic surveillance to see it. They saw it in behavior, in missed appointments, in sudden travel, in the way people stopped attending each other's gatherings. They saw it in the fact that someone, somewhere, had begun quietly separating themselves from the suspect's orbit, as if distance could protect them from the blast radius of the truth. The arrest had been the spark. The investigation was now the slow-burning fuse. Then came the late-night call that changed everything. It was not the suspect. It was not a lawyer. It was someone closer, someone whose voice carried panic that sounded raw, unpracticed. They didn't want to give their name at first. They asked questions instead, the kind that reveal what a person fears most. What happens to someone who didn't do it, but knew something? What happens to someone who helped with cleanup, even if they didn't understand what they were doing? What happens to someone who stayed quiet because they were told to, because they were scared, because they were young, because it was family, and family is supposed to be the one place you don't turn into the police? The detective on the line didn't offer comfort. Comfort is a trap. They offered clarity. They spoke about immunity in the careful language of law. They spoke about consequences. They spoke about the difference between being involved and being used. They spoke about the way secrets metastasize. The person on the other end went silent for a long moment, and in that silence, you could hear the sound of a life rearranging itself, the terrible math of loyalty versus survival. When they finally agreed to meet, it was under conditions that screamed fear. A neutral location. No family present. No promises beyond what could be legally promised. The person arrived trembling, eyes red, carrying the posture of someone who had been holding their breath for years and now didn't know how to exhale without drowning. They told detectives they had tried to forget the night. They told them they had tried to believe the story they were given. They told them they had spent years convincing themselves that memory was unreliable, that trauma distorts perception, that maybe they misunderstood. But the arrest had snapped something inside them. It had dragged the past into the present so violently that denial no longer worked. They described being woken up late, the time blurred but the feeling sharp, the atmosphere in the house wrong, voices too controlled, movements too deliberate. They described being told to stay inside, to stay quiet. They described a vehicle, not clearly at first, then more clearly as detectives asked calm questions. They described seeing something being moved, something heavy, not necessarily a body in the cinematic sense, but a shape that demanded effort, that required planning, that did not belong in the normal rhythm of a night. They described fear in someone's voice. And then, they said the line that made the detective's pen pause. They mentioned a location, an offhand reference that had been thrown at them as a warning back then, a place name, a direction, a don't ask, a you don't want to know. They had carried it like a splinter, small enough to ignore most days, sharp enough to hurt when pressed. Now they pressed it into the open. Detectives didn't celebrate. They didn't even react visibly. They knew better. They let the person keep talking, because when someone finally breaks years of silence, the first minutes are the most fragile. Interrupt, and they retreat. Push too hard, and they shut down. They guided gently, confirming details without demanding certainty. The person admitted they had never returned to that location. They admitted they had been afraid. They admitted that the suspect, if this is where the trail led, had used fear like a leash, tightening it whenever anyone drifted too close to questions. After the interview, investigators moved fast. Not with sirens. Not with a convoy. Fast in the way cold case teams move when they feel the ground under a story finally turning solid. They pulled resources. They requested warrants. They coordinated with forensic specialists. They checked land access. They planned a search that would not look dramatic on television, but would be exacting and exhaustive. The Florida heat didn't matter. The mosquitoes didn't matter. The time didn't matter. They had been waiting for this. The suspect, sensing something, began to unravel in small ways that only those trained to watch would notice. A change in routine. A sudden insistence on contacting certain family members. A request to retrieve personal belongings. The tone of communication through counsel sharpened, as if trying to reassert control by force of language. Control, however, was slipping. And when control slips, people do desperate things. Detectives anticipated that. They watched carefully, not just for flight, but for interference. They knew that if the location was real, If evidence existed, someone might try to destroy it. They moved the timetable up. They accelerated the search. Because in cases like this, the truth doesn't just wait to be found. Sometimes it fights back. As the team prepared to step onto that ground that may have held the answer for decades, the case reached a new kind of tension, not the tension of uncertainty, but the tension of proximity, the awful awareness that they were about to find something that would change everything, and that once you find it, you cannot put the world back the way it was. Somewhere in Florida, under heat and soil and years of silence, the cold case that began in 2001 was no longer just a mystery. It was a countdown. They rolled out before dawn, not in a parade, not with sirens, but in that quiet, disciplined way law enforcement moves when they're afraid of being watched, when they know a single rumor can poison a scene before a single shovel hits dirt. The air was thick even at that hour, Florida heat already awake, already clinging, and the highway lights slid across windshields like slow pulses, each mile carrying them closer to a place that had existed in the case file only as a possibility, a whispered direction, a name that had never been spoken on camera. No one in the vehicles talked much. When you've lived with a cold case for years, you learn not to celebrate before the ground gives you permission. They staged a mile away, at a dark corner of asphalt near a closed business. Engines off, radios low, maps spread across knees under dim interior lights. A forensic coordinator ran through the checklist again: warrants, boundaries, chain of custody, who steps first, who photographs what, where evidence goes, how it's sealed, how it's logged. Every instruction sounded ordinary, bureaucratic, but every word carried the same underlying truth. If we find something, it has to survive court, not just the moment. Detectives were thinking 2 steps ahead, already hearing defense attorneys calling the search contaminated, already imagining a jury staring at them with that dangerous expression of skepticism people wear when you ask them to believe something terrible without a body. The only antidote to that skepticism was discipline, and discipline begins before sunrise. They moved in, slow and precise, cutting through a gate line, stepping onto land that looked like nothing. That could have been any forgotten corner of Florida: palmetto scrub, uneven ground, a thin chorus of insects, a dampness rising from low spots where water collected. And yet the atmosphere was different. Everyone felt it. Maybe it was just the weight of expectation, the accumulated years pressing down, but it felt like the landscape had been holding its breath. The first sweep was visual. Eyes scanning for disturbances that didn't belong: old tire tracks, unnatural mounds, the subtle geometry of human interference. You learn to see the difference between nature's chaos and a person's attempt to hide order within it. Then came the dogs, handlers moving carefully, letting leashes slacken, watching for the smallest change: a pause, a pull, a sudden intensity. Dogs don't think in headlines. They think in scent. They don't care about betrayal. They don't care about family. They care about what the earth has absorbed. At first, nothing happened. The dogs moved through brush, circling, doubling back, noses down, tails flicking, and the detectives felt that familiar dread begin to rise. The fear that this was another dead end, another false hope, another week lost to a rumor that would collapse under sunlight. The forensic team positioned equipment anyway, ground-penetrating radar humming softly as it traced invisible lines across the soil, screens flickering with patterns that meant nothing to the untrained eye. It is a strange thing to watch technology interrogate the ground, to realize you can scan decades of concealment without moving a single grain of sand, and still not know if the truth is there until you dig. Then, one of the dogs stopped. Not a dramatic stop, not a sudden bark, just a hesitation, a tightening, a focused stillness that made the handler freeze. The dog moved a foot to the left, nose pressed close, inhaled again, then sat. The handler's face changed in an instant, the kind of change detectives know well, the moment when possibility becomes direction. Cameras came up. Notes were taken. Flags were placed. The dog was moved away and brought back. A second pass, a second confirmation. The animal sat again, stubborn, certain. No one spoke loudly. The quiet grew heavier. The radar operator shifted their grid toward the flagged area, running lines tighter, closer, refining the scan. On the screen, a subtle anomaly appeared, not a perfect box, not a cartoon outline, but a disturbance in the layering, a place where the soil's story didn't read like the rest. It could have been a root system. It could have been old debris. It could have been nothing. But paired with the dog's behavior, it became something else, a point. They marked it and called in the next layer of specialists. The first digs in a search like this are always shallow, almost gentle, as if the earth deserves respect for what it might be hiding. Shovels didn't slam down. They skimmed. Trowels scraped carefully. Soil was sifted through screens, the fine material falling away, leaving behind any unnatural objects like teeth in a grin. Every handful was photographed. Every change in color, in texture, was documented. It was slow, maddening work, the opposite of the urgency people expect from crime stories. But the slowness was deliberate. If you rush, you destroy. If you destroy, you lose. Hours passed under rising heat. Sweat-soaked shirts. Gloves darkened. Mosquitoes found every gap. The soil changed in subtle layers, darker here, sandier there, and the investigators kept their focus narrowed, refusing to let fatigue turn into sloppiness. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called, indifferent. Nearby, one detective's phone buzzed, a single text from a supervisor, media asking questions. Keep it tight. They already knew. News leaks like water. A cold case moves. People notice. They went deeper, and then the texture shifted again, more compact, more resistant, and the dig leader slowed even further, switching tools, using smaller motions. A scent rose from disturbed earth, wet and old. No one said what they were thinking. In that silence, each person's mind built its own images, each one darker than the last. It's the curse of these investigations. Hope and dread are twins. You can't invite one without the other. The first object appeared not with drama, but with a glint that didn't belong in soil. Metal. Not a knife, not a weapon, nothing so obvious, but something manufactured, something with straight edges where nature prefers curves. They cleared around it, hands working in tight, careful movements, and when it was finally free, they held it up as if it might speak. A keychain. Cheap, worn, the kind sold at gas stations, the kind people buy without thinking, the kind you clip to a set of keys and forget about until it's suddenly all you have. There was a small charm on it, scratched but recognizable, a shape that meant nothing to strangers but could mean everything to the right person. The team leader didn't smile, didn't react. They bagged it, sealed it, logged it, photographed it from every angle, because the court doesn't care about emotion. The court cares about procedure. They kept digging. A second object surfaced, then a third, small personal items, fragments of a life, not proof yet, but hints, the kind that make detectives' throats tighten. A piece of fabric caught on something hard. A broken plastic clip. A watch face without its band. Each item was treated like a fragile truth, handled with the kind of reverence you reserve for things that can change a case, and with the kind of fear you reserve for things that can break it if mishandled. Then the dig leader stopped completely and raised a hand. There was something else down there, larger, buried deeper, not fully visible yet, but the shape suggested containment, the outline of something that had been placed, not discarded. The air around the pit felt different, as if everyone was leaning in without moving, each breath careful, each heartbeat louder. Cameras clicked softly. A forensic photographer adjusted position. A detective glanced toward the tree line, scanning for movement, scanning for anyone watching, because if someone had tried to interfere, this was the moment they'd choose. And as if summoned by that thought, a vehicle appeared in the distance, slow, too slow, moving along the access path like it belonged there, like it was just someone checking on property, but the timing was wrong. The driver stopped short when they saw the cluster of people and equipment, paused, then started creeping forward again. A uniformed deputy stepped out, hand raised, firm. The vehicle halted. The driver claimed confusion, claimed they hadn't been told, claimed they were just passing through. The deputy's face remained blank. Confusion doesn't arrive this precisely. Confusion doesn't show up at the edge of a search site like a shadow with excuses. The person was turned away. Their license was noted. Their name logged. The deputies watched until the vehicle disappeared. The investigators returned to the pit, but the atmosphere had tightened, the awareness sharp now that the case might not just be about what was hidden, but about who still wanted it hidden. When the next layer of earth came away, the object revealed itself more clearly. Not a body, Not a skeleton, not the thing everyone's mind lunged toward, but a container, old, compromised, its surface degraded by time and moisture, wrapped in material that had once been meant to protect it from discovery. A plastic storage bin, the kind used for holiday decorations, for spare clothes, for things you don't want ruined. A thing that screams domestic normalcy even when used for something monstrous. The lid looked warped, edges brittle. The team leader didn't open it yet. Not here. Not like this. Evidence is not a spectacle. Evidence is a process. They stabilized it, documented it, packed around it, lifted it with both hands and controlled breath, like carrying something fragile and cursed. The container went into a secure evidence vehicle, sealed, logged, escorted. If there was anything inside that could speak, paper, fabric, hair, a trace, this was where it would survive to do so. As the convoy moved back toward the lab, phones began lighting up across the department. The media had caught the scent. Reporters were calling the scene a major development. Social media was already building its own version, posting old photos, naming names, turning speculation into certainty in real time. The family, scattered and tense, was learning about it the same way everyone else was, through alerts, through whispers, through that sickening feeling of reality collapsing. The suspect's attorney called within an hour, demanding information, protesting the search, hinting at violations, and prosecutors responded with calm, sterile language, refusing to confirm or deny, because confirmation is ammunition. The suspect, inside a cell, heard something too, not from official channels, but from the way the guards' faces changed, from the sudden shift in energy, from the fact that the air itself felt different when people know you're running out of room. Late that night, while lab techs worked under bright lights, gloved hands meticulous, evidence drying and cataloging, a detective sat alone at a desk and stared at the case file, at the victim's photograph, at the years of nothing, and felt something unfamiliar rise up. Not relief, not triumph, but dread sharpened by the sense that they were about to learn the truth in a form that would hurt more than ignorance ever did. Because whatever was inside that container, whether it was proof or only another cruel fragment, it had been waiting under Florida soil since 2001, and now it was finally in the light. And the moment the lab found its voice, the entire story, every vigil, every denial, every carefully maintained performance, would either collapse into guilt or explode into chaos. And somewhere behind bars, the suspect lay awake in the dark, listening to the building settle, listening to footsteps in the corridor, realizing, perhaps for the first time in decades, that the ground had shifted beneath them, and that the night they thought they buried had started to dig itself back up. Inside the lab, time moved differently, not in hours and minutes, but in procedures, in checklists, in gloved hands that never rushed because the smallest mistake could turn the most important evidence into nothing more than a story people argued about on the internet. The container sat on a stainless steel table under harsh white light, ordinary in shape, terrifying in implication, a plastic bin that could have held Christmas decorations, children's clothes, old family photos, and instead had been carried out of Florida soil like a sealed memory nobody wanted opened. Technicians photographed it from every angle. They measured it. They swabbed the exterior. They checked for trace material clinging to seams. Everything was documented in a language colder than grief. Item number, seal intact, chain of custody confirmed, transfer recorded. Detectives watched from behind a glass partition, silent, faces tight, the way people look when they're close enough to touch closure and still afraid it might evaporate. Outside that building, the town was already on fire with rumor. They found the body. They found nothing. They found proof. Every version traveled faster than truth. Every version carried the same cruel hunger. Make it make sense. But inside the lab, nobody said body. Nobody said murder. They said contents. They said material. They said possible remains. They said potential identification. Because investigators learn early that language can save a case or destroy it. When the lid finally came off, it wasn't a cinematic reveal, no sudden gasp, no dramatic music, only a slow lift, a soft crack of brittle plastic, the faintest release of stale air, and then a stillness that felt heavier than anything in the room. The contents were layered, wrapped, protected, not with care, but with intent. Inside were items that told a story without speaking, personal objects, fabric, fragments of a life packaged like cargo. Text moved with the delicacy of surgeons, separating, bagging, labeling, each piece treated as if it might be the one that mattered most. For a moment, the room felt like a museum of someone's disappearance, and every person present understood they were looking at the physical residue of a betrayal that had been carried quietly for decades. The first tests were not about drama. They were about certainty. Tissue samples, bone fragments, handled with the clinical distance that keeps people functioning, were prepared for analysis. DNA extraction began. Comparison samples were requested from relatives. Old records were pulled, dental charts if they existed, medical records, anything that could anchor identity in science rather than hope. Detectives called prosecutors with cautious updates. Prosecutors called supervisors. Supervisors called nobody, because the one thing everyone agreed on was this: do not let the public narrative outrun what you can prove. Outside, it already had. By afternoon, news vans were parked near the department. Reporters shouted questions at anyone in uniform. Social media had turned the search site into a mythic location, zooming in on satellite images, posting coordinates, claiming certainty with the confidence only ignorance can afford. Friends of the suspect insisted the police were framing them. Others demanded the harshest punishment before any lab results were even complete. The victim's name trended again, wrapped in hashtags and opinion, as if decades of pain could be reduced to a caption. Inside the jail, the suspect felt the shift like a temperature drop. They had been living on denial and routine, on legal strategy and stubbornness, and now that routine was breaking apart. Guards treated them differently, not necessarily cruelly, but with that subtle distance people create when they believe you're guilty. Inmates stared longer. Whispers followed. Even without official confirmation, the suspect could sense the world tightening, closing doors that had once remained open. They made calls through counsel, demanded updates, demanded reassurance, demanded certainty, and received none, because certainty was now in the hands of lab techs, not lawyers. The detectives didn't wait for DNA to begin moving. They couldn't. Cold cases don't give you the luxury of pause once the momentum returns, because every step forward shakes loose something fragile. They went back to financial records again, looking for anomalies around the time of the disappearance. Unexpected purchases, storage units rented under different names, cleaning supplies bought late at night, gas station receipts. They re-interviewed old neighbors, not asking what they remembered emotionally, but what they remembered materially. Cars, trash pickup patterns, strange smells, sudden landscaping work, anything that might have seemed like nothing back then and now looked like a signal. And there it was. A small detail that had been logged and forgotten. A neighbor recalling that shortly after the disappearance, the yard had been fixed, disturbed earth smoothed out. A patch of landscaping changed, not dramatically, but enough to notice. At the time, it had seemed like grief, like distraction, like someone trying to keep busy. Now, paired with the discovery of the container, it looked like something else entirely: maintenance of the lie. They pulled permits. They checked receipts from local nurseries. They traced a purchase made in cash, a batch of sod, a set of pavers, a load of topsoil. None of it was illegal. All of it was ordinary. That was the point. The best concealment is ordinary. The best crime scene is domestic routine. The lab results did not arrive with a trumpet. They arrived in a call, late evening, a voice controlled but charged with the weight of what it carried. Preliminary DNA profile obtained. Comparison initiated. High likelihood match pending confirmation. Detectives felt their stomachs knot with something close to dread, because high likelihood is not a headline yet, but it is enough to change how you sleep. Prosecutors requested an immediate briefing. Detectives gathered in a windowless room where the air always felt stale, where case files lived and died, where decisions were made that altered lives. They spoke in measured sentences, because you have to, when you're building a case around absence that has finally begun to solidify into presence. The container suggests concealment. The location suggests knowledge. The items suggest connection. The witness statements suggest motive. The suspect's timeline fails under data. It was a mosaic, not a single piece, and prosecutors asked the hardest question, the one that always comes in cases like this. Can we prove murder beyond a reasonable doubt? Or are we simply proving the suspect lied? Detectives understood the trap. Lies aren't always crimes. People lie for many reasons: shame, fear, reputation. But a lie that surrounds a death, a disappearance, a concealment, becomes something else. The prosecutors began shaping the narrative that could hold in court. Not a sensational story, not a soap opera, but a sequence of choices. A conflict, a moment, a concealment, years of control, an eventual unraveling. Jurors don't need to know every detail of the night. They need to know enough to see the pattern. They need to understand why innocence stops making sense. While the law prepared, the family collapsed in real time. One relative publicly condemned the suspect, voice shaking, eyes wet, declaring they had been deceived. Another defended them fiercely, insisting the police were twisting evidence, insisting this was a witch hunt fueled by media pressure. Old alliances shattered. People who had once stood shoulder to shoulder at vigils now refused to sit in the same room. The betrayal wasn't just the original act. It was the years of shared grief now recast as performance. Every memory became suspect. Every holiday photo became contaminated. The town watched the family disintegrate like a slow-motion wreck and felt a collective sickness. If you can't trust family, what can you trust? Then the DNA confirmation hit. It came with numbers and probability, a match so strong it ceased being likely and became identified. The remains were the victim. The missing person was no longer missing. They were found, packed, hidden, left beneath Florida earth like an object someone wanted erased. For detectives, it was a milestone. For the family, it was a death that happened twice. Once in 2001, and again now, in the form of proof. Prosecutors moved swiftly after that. They updated charges, expanded theories, prepared motions. They anticipated the defense's strategies, challenged the search, challenged the chain of custody, challenged the witness credibility, argue contamination, argue alternative explanations, argue that the suspect was being punished for being unlikable, not for being guilty. Prosecutors responded by tightening every screw. They filed to admit prior inconsistent statements. They prepared expert testimony on concealment behavior. They built a timeline that didn't require guessing, a timeline anchored to data, to receipts, to cell towers, to witness accounts that now finally aligned. Detectives returned to the suspect with the new reality hanging between them, heavy and undeniable. They didn't wave papers like trophies. They didn't announce, "We got you." They asked one question, quietly, the way you ask something that changes the shape of a room. Do you still want to tell us nothing happened? The suspect's face tightened. Their eyes flicked away for a fraction of a second, a micro-movement that meant little to most people and everything to investigators trained to watch. Their attorney spoke quickly, ending the interview, invoking rights, shutting the door. But the suspect's silence now had a different texture. Before, it was a wall. Now, it was a corner. And corners create desperate choices. The next day, jail calls were reviewed, not because detectives expected a confession, but because desperation leaks into language. There were phrases that raised flags. Mentions of "they found it." Mentions of "I told you." Mentions of "don't talk to them." The suspect wasn't confessing. They were managing. They were trying to reassert control from behind bars, trying to keep the last pieces of the old silence intact. But silence had already begun to collapse. A final piece was still missing, the one prosecutors wanted most, the direct link, the undeniable thread tying the suspect to the container, to the location, to the act of concealment. DNA established the victim. It did not automatically establish the killer. The case still required connection, and connection in a cold case often comes from the smallest things. A fiber, a fingerprint preserved in just the right place, a trace caught in a seam. The lab kept working. They swabbed the container's interior edges. They tested the tape. They examined the wrapping material. They searched for hair. They searched for skin cells. They searched for anything the human body leaves behind without permission. They processed it all with the same relentless patience that had finally brought the case this far. Because if you're going to accuse a person of betraying their own blood, you need more than a story. You need the kind of evidence that speaks even when nobody else will. And as the evidence accumulated in sterile bags and digital files, the case moved toward its most dangerous moment. Not the arrest, not the discovery, but the point where someone, somewhere, realizes the truth is no longer containable and decides to save themselves by sacrificing someone else. Because in a family betrayal, the final act is rarely silence. It's the moment one person finally says, out loud, what everyone has been afraid to admit. I know what happened, and I can prove it. The call didn't come through a dramatic tip line with a shaky, anonymous voice and a promise of secret knowledge. It came through an attorney's office, clipped and professional, a request for a meeting that sounded like procedure but tasted like panic. The kind of call that makes detectives straighten in their chairs because they can hear the subtext beneath the words. Someone is trying to survive this, and survival has a price. They met in a sterile conference room that smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and old coffee, the kind of room where truth is negotiated in billable hours. The attorney arrived first, neat suit, controlled posture, eyes that never stopped calculating. The client came in behind, shoulders hunched, face drawn, the expression of someone who hasn't slept in days because every time they close their eyes they see dirt, plastic, and a night that refuses to stay buried. They sat, hands clasped too tightly, and for a long moment they didn't speak at all, as if waiting for someone else to take responsibility for the words. The detective didn't offer comfort. Comfort blurs edges. They offered silence, and silence did what it always does in rooms like this. It forced a choice. The client swallowed, glanced at their attorney, then at the detective, then down at the table like the wood grain might offer an escape route, and finally said, in a voice that cracked on the first syllable, that they were ready to tell what they knew, but they needed to know what would happen to them if they did. That question hung in the air like smoke, because everyone in the room understood what it meant. People who know nothing don't ask about consequences. People who are merely curious don't bring lawyers. People who are haunted for years don't suddenly appear when the lab confirms identity unless something has shifted inside them, unless fear has finally outweighed loyalty. The detective answered carefully, in the measured language of law, explaining cooperation, potential immunity, the difference between being an accessory and being a witness, the way the state sees intent and participation. The attorney listened, nodded, then asked for clarity on specifics, trying to pull certainty out of a system built on discretion. The client's breathing got faster. Their eyes grew wet. And then the words started coming, not in a neat timeline, not in a story designed to sound credible, but in bursts, jagged and messy, as if ripped from a place that had been locked for years. They said they had been there, not at the moment the disappearance began, not at the exact point where violence occurred, but close enough to feel it, close enough to smell the air in the house when it changed, close enough to hear a sound that didn't belong in a normal night. They described the suspect's voice, low and controlled, the kind of control that feels like danger when you're young, the kind that tells you not to ask questions because questions are how you get hurt. They described being pulled aside, told to stay out of the way, told that something bad had happened, told that what they were about to see would ruin them if they spoke. They described the house lights dimmed, the curtains drawn, the late-night stillness outside making every sound inside feel amplified. They described an object being moved, heavy, awkward, handled with the careful urgency of someone who needs the job done before sunrise. They did not use the word body, not at first. They said, it. And the attorney flinched when they said it, and the detective noted it silently, because language reveals how people have survived their own memories. Then the client said they helped. Not because they wanted to, not because they planned it, because they were told to, because they were scared, because in that moment, in that house, family wasn't safety, it was command. They described carrying items to a vehicle, cleaning materials, bags, a roll of tape. Things that sounded ordinary when listed but felt grotesque when placed in context. They described the suspect moving like someone who had done something irreversible and was now operating on pure instinct, pure panic disguised as precision. They described being told to keep their mouth shut, to look normal, to act like the world hadn't changed. The detective asked where the vehicle went. The client swallowed again, eyes darting to the attorney, then back, and they said the location, the same direction whispered before, but now with detail, the road, the turnoff, the darkness, the sense of leaving civilization behind. They described arriving at a place that smelled like wet earth, a patch of land that felt remote even though it wasn't far, a Florida in-between space where people don't go unless they have a reason. They described the suspect opening the trunk. They described the container. Yes, the container. Mentioned now like a curse, and the detective felt the muscles in their jaw tighten, because this wasn't theory anymore. This was narrative linking directly to evidence. They described the suspect placing things inside, wrapping, sealing, working fast, breathing hard, hands shaking despite the show of control. They described being handed a shovel and then not being able to say no. They described digging in soil that fought back, roots snagging, sand collapsing in on itself, the sweat running down their back even in the night air. They described the suspect watching the tree line, listening for cars, listening for voices, every second loaded with the fear of being seen. They described the moment the container went into the ground, the dull thud of plastic against earth, the finality of it, the way the suspect's face looked in the flash of a car interior light when they leaned in close and said, in a voice so calm it made the client's skin crawl, that if anyone ever talked, they would join it. The client's hands were shaking now. They pressed their palms together to steady them, nails biting into skin. The attorney slid a tissue box across the table without looking at it, still professional, still controlled, but the room had changed. The air had changed. The story had weight. The detective asked the question that matters most in these moments, the question that separates rumor from testimony. What did you see, exactly? The client's eyes closed. Their lips moved silently for a second as if rehearsing. Then they opened their eyes and said there had been fabric, there had been hair, there had been a shape wrapped in something that was not designed to keep it safe, only to keep it hidden. They said they didn't see a face. They said they didn't want to. They said they tried to look away. They said the suspect forced them to look anyway, as if sharing the horror would guarantee their silence, as if trauma could be weaponized into loyalty. The detective didn't react outwardly. You can't. Not here. Not when the person talking is teetering on the edge of shutting down. They asked about the night itself, about what led up to it, about whether there was an argument, whether voices were raised, whether anything in the house suggested a moment of escalation. The client hesitated, then admitted there had been tension for months, tension everyone could feel but nobody named, the kind that hides in dinner table silence and clipped replies, the kind that bursts out when someone finally says the wrong thing. They described overhearing a fight earlier that day, words about money, about control, about leaving, about secrets that could ruin someone. They described the suspect's face after, eyes flat, jaw tight, the expression of someone who felt cornered. The attorney interrupted then, careful, reminding the client to stay within what they personally knew, what they personally observed, but it was too late. The shape of motive had already entered the room. Control threatened. Exposure feared. A desperate choice. It didn't need melodrama. It needed only human weakness. When the statement ended, it wasn't with a flourish. It ended with exhaustion. The client slumped, shoulders caving as if the words had been holding them upright for years, and now that they'd released them, they had nothing left. The attorney asked again about protections. The detective explained that nothing could be promised beyond process, that prosecutors would decide, that cooperation mattered, that lying now would bury them too. The client nodded rapidly, insisting they would tell everything, insisting they would testify, insisting they couldn't carry it anymore. That night, detectives moved on two fronts at once, because a statement like that is not the end, it's the beginning of proof. They drafted warrants to seize additional evidence linked to the suspect, storage receipts, tools, vehicles if any still existed, property records, digital devices. They requested a full forensic comparison between the container materials and anything that could tie back to the suspect's home, tape types, fibers, even microscopic particles lodged in seams. They pulled jail call recordings again with a new lens, searching for language that now sounded less like stress and more like management of a co-conspirator. Prosecutors, now armed with testimony placing the suspect at the concealment site, prepared to tighten the legal net. They considered enhancements, considered additional charges, considered whether to offer the client limited immunity for truthful cooperation. They debated risk. Because juries distrust deals, they distrust witnesses who save themselves by pointing at someone else, and defense attorneys know exactly how to poison that distrust into doubt. Prosecutors demanded corroboration, demanded something that couldn't be explained away as a desperate person trying to escape responsibility. The lab answered with the cold precision of science. A partial latent print, degraded but present, recovered from an interior edge of the container lid where hands had gripped while sealing. Not a full fingerprint perfect for a television montage, but enough to be compared, enough to produce a conclusion with the right standards. Touch DNA recovered from the tape. Again, not cinematic, but stubborn. Cells left behind without permission, the body's quiet betrayal of the mind's desire to conceal. The results didn't shout. They accumulated. They layered. They turned narrative into structure. In jail, the suspect learned about the cooperating witness the way suspects often do. Not from official announcements, but from the change in how their attorney spoke, from the sudden urgency, from the fact that strategy conversations shifted from, "we'll fight this," to, "we need to understand exposure." The suspect's face tightened. Their voice rose. They demanded names. They demanded to know who was talking. They demanded to make phone calls they were not allowed to make. And when those demands failed, they did what people who lose control often do. They tried to rewrite the story from the inside. A message was passed through channels that felt casual but were not. A suggestion to family members about what to say, what not to say, who to trust, who was turning. The suspect wasn't confessing. They were directing. And that direction was, in itself, evidence of consciousness of guilt, a behavior prosecutors love because it doesn't rely on memory. It relies on present action. It shows that the need for control never left. It only changed its form. The community watched this new turn with a different kind of horror. Finding the victim had been a grim answer. Hearing that a family member might have helped bury them was something else entirely. It shattered the last comforting illusion that evil comes from outside. This evil had grown inside a living room, inside shared meals, inside family photos. People began looking at their own lives differently, listening harder to arguments behind closed doors, wondering what could be hidden beneath routine. Detectives scheduled the next interview with the cooperating witness, this time recorded, formal, structured, preparing them for court, locking in details before fear could twist them back into silence. The witness arrived again, paler, trembling, but resolute, and as they spoke into the microphone, the sound of their own voice saying it all out loud seemed to break something inside them, a final barrier, because once you say it on record, you can never pretend you didn't know. The prosecutors finalized their move. They prepared to confront the suspect not for information, not for closure, but for leverage. They needed one last piece, the final fracture, the moment when the suspect understood they were no longer facing an investigation, but a constructed reality backed by science and testimony, a reality that could put them away forever. They brought the suspect into a room again, attorney present, and they didn't argue, didn't plead, didn't threaten. They placed a folder on the table, thick with results, statements, comparisons, timelines, and they let it sit there like a weight. The suspect stared at it, jaw clenching, eyes narrowing, the old performance trying to rise, trying to find air. The attorney spoke first, pushing back, challenging, requesting discovery. The prosecutor responded calmly, then slid forward a single page, not the entire case, just one sentence from the cooperating witness's statement, a sentence describing the container going into the ground, describing the suspect's voice, describing the threat, word for word. The suspect's face changed. Not dramatically, not enough for a headline. Enough for a human being who has been holding a lie for decades to feel the floor tilt beneath them. Because for the first time, the secret wasn't just in the past. It was in someone else's mouth. And that is when desperation becomes truly dangerous. Because when a person realizes they can no longer control the story, they will either surrender to the truth or they will try to burn the entire world down to keep from being the only one blamed. The moment the suspect realized the secret had escaped their control, the air inside that room tightened like a wire pulled to its limit, and everyone present felt the same thing at once, that invisible shift when a person stops believing they can talk their way out and starts calculating what they can destroy on the way down. The attorney spoke fast, procedural, demanding discovery, objecting to phrasing, trying to pull the conversation back into the safe language of law. But the prosecutor's calm didn't change, and calm in a room like that is its own kind of threat, because it tells you the chaos is no longer on your side. The suspect stared at the page as if the words could be erased by sheer will, jaw working, eyes narrowing, and then something flickered across their face. Rage, fear, betrayal. Yes, betrayal. The bitter irony of it. As if they were the one being wronged now. As if decades of silence had been a contract everyone else had just broken. They didn't confess. Not then. Not in the cinematic way people crave. What they did instead was smaller and more telling. A refusal to meet anyone's eyes, a rigid insistence on no comment, a request to end the interview that came too quickly, too sharply, like a door slammed to keep the truth from entering. Guards led them back to a cell, and the corridor swallowed their footsteps, but the damage was already done. A cooperating witness, a recovered container, a DNA identification, trace material linking hands to concealment. The case that had spent years frozen in uncertainty was now moving with momentum that didn't require belief. It required only time, and time, this time, was working for the state. In the days that followed, the courthouse became the new stage, not for spectacle, but for inevitability. Motions filed. Evidence lists expanded. Media camped outside like vultures waiting for the next scrap. Prosecutors spoke carefully, refusing to feed the frenzy. But their filings did the talking for them, the sterile language of legal documents carrying words that hit the town like punches. Human remains identified, concealment, tampering, probable cause. The defense attacked everything. The search was improper. The chain of custody questionable. The cooperating witness unreliable, motivated by self-preservation. The investigators biased by years of pressure. The same arguments, sharpened by desperation, thrown at the wall in hopes something would stick. But the wall was no longer just a theory. It was a timeline backed by science. The victim's name returned to the news not as missing, but as found, and that single word reprogrammed the way the community breathed. For years, the town had lived inside the ambiguous pain of disappearance, the strange limbo where hope is both lifeline and torture. Now hope had nowhere to hide. Now grief had to become real. Vigils returned. But they felt different, less like prayers for return, more like apologies spoken into humid air, people clutching candles and shaking their heads, whispering, "How could this happen? How could we not see it? How could it be family?" The phrase, family betrayal, wasn't just a headline anymore. It was a stain that touched everyone who had ever trusted someone simply because blood said they should. At the center of that stain, the family fractured in ways the public could finally see. Some relatives refused to speak to reporters, windows dark, curtains pulled, silence thicker than any statement. Others spoke too much, lashing out, defending, condemning, contradicting each other on live television like the family itself had become another crime scene, chaotic, contaminated. Old photos surfaced online, smiling faces at birthdays, holidays, weddings, and now those smiles looked like evidence to strangers, as if guilt could be found in the curve of a mouth. The town consumed those images with a hunger that felt like justice, but sounded a lot like cruelty. The cooperating witness, now formally documented, was moved through a world of protection and suspicion, escorted between interviews and legal consultations, learning the hard truth that coming forward doesn't end fear, it changes its shape. Some people called them brave. Others called them a liar. Others called them worse. The defense's strategy was simple and brutal. If the witness is tainted, the story collapses. Prosecutors prepared for that brutality by doing what the law demands: corroboration. They didn't need the witness to be perfect. They needed the witness to be anchored. The container existed. The location existed. The victim's DNA existed. The trace evidence existed. And the witness's account, messy and human, threaded through those facts like wire through concrete. In private rooms where jurors would never sit, prosecutors practiced the narrative again and again, stripping out drama, because drama is the enemy of credibility. They built it as a chain of choices, each link visible. The victim intended to leave, or threatened to reveal something, or refused to stay controlled. Whatever the exact spark had been, the evidence suggested the same outcome: escalation behind closed doors, a moment where anger and fear collided, and then a decision, not necessarily planned years in advance, but made with cold clarity in the hours that followed. Remove the person, remove the trace, control the story, let time do the rest. Time almost did. Almost. The defense pushed for doubt with the only weapon they had left: the absence of a witnessed killing. They argued that concealment does not equal murder, that accidents happen, that panic happens, that the suspect may have found the victim already gone and acted irrationally, that someone else could have done it, that family conflict is not homicide. The law, in its cold logic, allows these arguments, because it must. And that was the final cruelty of the case. The truth could be obvious to the heart, and still vulnerable to the rules of proof. Then came the detail that changed the tone again, not because it was flashy, but because it revealed intent with a quiet violence the jury would understand. A pattern of communications after the disappearance. Calls and messages that weren't frantic, not desperate, not searching, but controlled, directing others, calming others, discouraging questions. Not proof of a killing, but proof of a mind moving into management mode. The kind of management that begins when you know the outcome and your only priority is containment. Prosecutors didn't present it as mind reading. They presented it as behavior. Behavior doesn't require imagination. It requires observation. The court date arrived like a storm front, building for weeks, then breaking in a single morning of flashing cameras and hushed conversations and the sound of shoes on courthouse tile. The suspect entered in chains, face composed, eyes forward, performing innocence with the same discipline that had served them for years. For a second, they looked almost like the grieving person the public had once believed in, and that illusion was what made the whole thing so sickening. Evil isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a person who can stand beside a candle and speak of hope while keeping the truth locked underground. Testimony began. Experts spoke in careful language, explaining DNA probability and trace evidence, explaining how material transfers, how skin cells cling to tape, how a partial print can survive time if protected from light and friction. The jury watched, trying to translate science into certainty, faces serious, hands still. Then the cooperating witness took the stand, and the room tightened again, because science is cold, but a witness is human, and humans crack under cross-examination in ways that can either reveal truth or destroy it. They told the story with a voice that shook at first, then steadied as the words became inevitable, describing the late-night fear, the commands, the container, the digging, the threat. The defense attacked immediately, slicing at memory, at motive, at years of silence. Why didn't you come forward? Why now? What did you receive in exchange? Are you lying to save yourself? The witness flinched, swallowed, answered, and in those answers, the jury saw what the town had been forced to see. Fear can keep a person quiet for years, especially when the fear wears a familiar face. The defense pressed harder, trying to trigger contradiction, and for a moment, it seemed like the witness might crumble, might retreat into the old instinct to protect the family name even as it burned. But then they said, simply, that they were tired of waking up with the night still in their throat, tired of seeing the victim's face on old posters, tired of living inside a lie they didn't choose but were forced to carry, and that line landed in the courtroom like a weight. The verdict did not come quickly. It never does, not when years of silence have to be reshaped into legal certainty. The jury disappeared into deliberation, and the town held its breath the way it had in 2001, waiting for a different kind of answer this time. Outside, people argued. Inside, the suspect sat still, expression locked, as if refusing to participate could somehow deny reality. Detectives waited without speaking much, because detectives learn the hard way that hope is dangerous even when you think you've earned it. When the jury returned, the room stood, and for a heartbeat everything paused. The entire story balanced on a single human decision. The foreperson's voice was steady, the words formal, and yet they struck with the force of a weapon. Guilty, on the charges that mattered, guilty enough for the state to finally write an ending where there had been only ellipses. The suspect's face tightened, the smallest tremor of something breaking behind the eyes, but no outburst came, no collapse, just the slow realization that control was gone, that the narrative had escaped for good, that the family betrayal now belonged to the record, not to whispers. Sentencing day carried its own cold gravity, victims' statements spoken into a room that could never give the victim back. Family members spoke through tears, some begging for mercy, some begging for maximum punishment, voices overlapping in grief and rage, proof that the crime had not ended in 2001. It had simply been living quietly among them. The judge delivered years in a measured tone, the law's attempt to convert horror into numbers, and the gavel fell like a door closing on decades of denial. But closure is not the same thing as peace. Because even after the conviction, questions hung in the air like humidity. What exactly happened in the moments before the disappearance turned irreversible? Whether it was planned or spontaneous. Whether others knew more than they admitted. Whether silence was shared or enforced. The case was solved in the eyes of the law, yet the emotional geometry remained jagged, because the truth, when it arrives late, doesn't heal in a straight line. It rips. It rearranges. It makes you revisit every memory with suspicion. In Florida, the street where it began tried to return to normal, but normal is a fragile performance once a town learns how easily it can be faked. People kept their porch lights on longer. They watched cars passing too slowly. They listened when arguments rose behind closed doors. The victim's name was no longer a question mark, but it was also no longer a living hope, and that loss carried a different kind of ache. A plaque appeared somewhere, quiet and simple. Flowers were placed. The air remained warm, indifferent, as if the state itself could not absorb what it had held for so long. And on some nights, when the humidity pressed hard and the neighborhood went still, people swore they could feel the past moving through the dark, not as a ghost in the supernatural sense, but as the residue of a truth that arrived too late to save anyone from the years it stole. The cold case was solved. The headlines declared victory. The arrest had shocked the community exactly as predicted, but the real shock wasn't the cuffs or the verdict or the container lifted from soil. The real shock was the simplest, ugliest lesson left behind, the one that doesn't fade with time. The most dangerous secrets aren't always buried in remote places. They're buried in families, in familiar smiles, in ordinary homes. And when they finally surface, they don't just reveal what happened to the missing. They reveal what everyone was capable of becoming while pretending nothing was wrong.